Good morning. I'm honored to kick off our first oversight hearing as the chairman of the Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development Subcommittee. I want to thank Ranking Member Collins, who has served as chairman of this important subcommittee for many years with Jack Reed. Senator Collins, there is literally no one in the United States Senate would be more pleased to work with who's got a longer and more substantial track record of bipartisan accomplishment on the Appropriations Committee, but really throughout the Senate. So it's going to be a pleasure to work with you. This hearing is the first of two to examine how departments under our jurisdiction manage disaster recovery programs and how we can make our communities more resilient to the effects of climate change. Today's focus is on the Department of Transportation. For transportation, building back is step one in disaster recovery. We need to build back better to be more resilient. This saves money in the long term and allows for a quicker recovery in the short term. We need to move beyond quick fixes and push state transportation departments to include resiliency in all aspects of transportation infrastructure, including their planning, design, materials, and engineering. We need investments in resiliency to help communities adapt to the effects of climate change. Every day that we fail to act, we become more vulnerable. We see the impacts of climate change everywhere with increased flooding and repeated major disaster events every year. Coastal communities and critical roadways are quite literally being reclaimed by the ocean itself. DOT has started to work on this through the Federal Highways Administration, which now allows states to include resiliency features such as shoreline stabilization and larger culverts when building back from a disaster. But the department still needs to provide consistent guidance on the approval process and treat resiliency as a core feature and not as an added luxury. The department should also take action to encourage state and local transportation agencies to think more broadly about resiliency. It's not just about roadways. It's also about ports, airports, railways that are all essential to our economy. These assets need to be able to recover quickly from extreme weather events and adapt to sea level rise. The recent events of the Colonial Pipeline also highlight the need to incorporate cybersecurity into our resiliency framework. While DHS has jurisdiction over cybersecurity and the security of critical infrastructure, there is no federal agency that regulates mandatory cybersecurity standards for our nation's pipelines. The administration is taking an aggressive and whole-of-government approach to this issue. Deputy Secretary Trottenberg, I look forward to your comments on how DOT is supporting this effort. I'm glad to see the administration's American Jobs Plan includes dedicated funding for infrastructure resiliency programs. Specifically, it includes $8 billion for the Department of Transportation, including $3 billion for the National Resilient Communities Challenge and $5 billion for PROTECT grants. I want to highlight that PROTECT grants were part of the Senate reauthorization bill marked up by EPW on a unanimous vote last Congress, so that we know that there is broad bipartisan support for dedicated funding for resiliency. But $8 billion is not nearly enough, and this funding needs to be available to all modes. In addition to the American Jobs Plan proposal, I'm glad to see the administration incorporating resiliency into its competitive grant process. The department should provide more technical assistance to state and local governments and update policy guidance to incorporate resiliency into the day-to-day work of transportation planners and engineers. This is important because, as we know, these changes must come from the local level, not just Washington, D.C. With that, I'd like to turn it over to our ranking member, Senator Collins.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me begin my remarks today by congratulating you on assuming the chairmanship of this important subcommittee. I'm sure that you will enjoy it and be a great leader as we work together. I also want to pay tribute to Senator Reed, with whom I worked. We sort of went back and forth as chairman and ranking member for a long time. And he did a great job, and we always worked together in a bipartisan way. And I know that you, Senator Schatz, and I will do so as well. I also want to thank you for holding an extraordinarily timely hearing on disaster recovery programs and transportation resiliency. I welcome each of our witnesses who are joining us today, and I'm particularly pleased to welcome Dr. Habib Dagher, who joins us from the University of Maine. Today's discussion regarding disaster recovery and transportation resiliency is, as you noted, particularly timely given the devastating cyber attack on a major pipeline. It demonstrates the need for our critical infrastructure to be hardened against such attacks and for mandatory reporting of attacks on our critical infrastructure. The administration recently released its infrastructure plan, a more than $4 trillion proposal that goes far beyond the traditional definition of infrastructure and prioritizes expensive subsidies for electric vehicles over the repair and replacement of roads, bridges, highways, airports, and seaports, and includes social programs not traditionally considered infrastructure. As everyone's aware, there are some Republicans who have also proposed an infrastructure package that would target core transportation infrastructure, as well as water systems and broadband expansion. For my part, I support a robust infrastructure investment in this country, and I worked hard with the former chairman of the subcommittee to increase funding for many critical programs to address our country's physical and digital infrastructure needs. As Senator Schatz and I know, the infrastructure needs of Hawaii are quite different from those in the state of Maine. But in many ways, I think that's important because it helps us recognize that states have different needs and that our programs need to be flexible enough to recognize that. As a member of the Senate Intelligence Committee and the former chair of the Homeland Security Committee, quite some time ago, I've long had an interest in cybersecurity for our critical infrastructure, and I look forward to pursuing that issue. In fact, I'm working with Senators Warner and Rubio on a cybersecurity bill that we will introduce shortly. As a member of the bipartisan Senate Climate Solutions Caucus, I've worked with many of my colleagues across the aisle to build consensus for programs that can help combat climate change while supporting our infrastructure. Today, we'll learn more about our country's needs in terms of disaster response, transportation resiliency, and improving our infrastructure through research, development, construction materials, building techniques, and more. Whether it is for disaster recovery, infrastructure longevity, or sustainability, research and investment in new techniques and materials has the potential to extend the life of critical public works and make them more resilient. Recently, I introduced a bill that focuses on innovative materials. It's called the Imagine Act with Senator Whitehouse. Our bill would fund research into new materials and building techniques and spur federal investment in bridge and water infrastructure projects that use innovative materials and techniques, prioritizing coastal and rural projects. This would help translate research into practice, an area where the University of Maine has been a national leader. I'll talk more about Dr. Habib Dagher's work when I introduce him later, but let me say that the University of Maine's Advanced Structures and Composites Center has grown from 4 to 260 personnel and is housed in a 100,000 square foot laboratory, making it the largest university-based research center in the state of Maine. Among other achievements, the Composite Centers has developed technologies to build the longest composite materials highway bridge in the country. I'm pleased to say it happens to be located in the state of Maine and was completed in cooperation with Maine's Department of transportation. Dr. Dogger is also leading the Transportation Infrastructure Durability Center at the university, which was recently established with the U.S. Department of Transportation funding under a highly competitive grant program. It brings together the expertise of New England state DOTs and 6 universities in developing more sustainable materials and construction methods. The University of Maine is also working with one of our national labs. I look forward to hearing from all of our distinguished witnesses and working with them as well as the chairman and other members of this committee to advance our shared bipartisan priorities. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Collins. I now want to turn to our panel of witnesses and welcome all of you to the subcommittee. First, we have the Honorable Polly Trottenberg, Deputy Secretary of the Department of Transportation. Congratulations on your confirmation. I'm honored that your first congressional hearing will be before this subcommittee. Next, we will have Ms. Elizabeth Repko, Acting Director of the Physical Infrastructure Team at GAO. From Hawaii, up at 4 a.m., we have my friend, Mr. Ed Sniffen. Ed is the Deputy Director for Highways at Hawaii DOT. Mr. Sniffen is also the chair of the AASHTO Committee on Transportation System Security and Resiliency. Thank you so much for being up early to share your experience with us, Ed. And finally, we have Dr. Habib Dogger, who is the Executive Director of the Advanced Structures and Composites Center, as well as the founder of the Transportation Infrastructure Durability Center. Mr. Dogger, thank you for joining us here today to share your expertise. Deputy Secretary Trottenberg, you may proceed with your testimony.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Schatz, Ranking Member Collins, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today about the Department of Transportation's policies and approaches to enhance infrastructure resilience and how the President's American Jobs Plan will help us create stronger, more resilient transportation systems. Today we'll discuss one of the most critical infrastructure risks, climate change, as well as the growing challenge of cybersecurity in light of the recent Colonial Pipeline cyber attack. This administration recognizes that climate change is here and demands a national response. Wildfires, droughts, floods, and other high-impact weather events have become more and more common. They've destroyed communities, damaged infrastructure, and claimed lives. And the cost has been staggering. In 2020 alone, the U.S. suffered 22 weather disasters that each cost at least $1 billion in damages. When Superstorm Sandy charged up the Atlantic coast in the fall of 2012, it brought a record-setting storm surge that claimed lives, destroyed homes and businesses, left millions without power, and cost tens of billions. We've seen similar destruction caused by Hurricane Harvey in 2017, the California wildfires in 2020, and the winter ice storm in Texas just a few months ago, along with many other events. We're still rebuilding and learning from these disasters, but they have taught us that we must proactively incorporate resilience into our infrastructure, rather than turn to federal emergency relief after the damage is done. And clearly, we must consider cybersecurity as another dimension of resiliency. While we're pleased that the Colonial Pipeline was back online last night, the cyber attack and resulting shutdown have had an effect on the regional fuel supply. The President has directed the entire administration to bring all resources to bear in addressing the situation, working in concert with our sister agencies. The extraordinary team at DOT, across all the modes, work to facilitate the transport of fuel and the reopening of the pipeline. The Colonial Pipeline incident underscores that in addition to protecting critical infrastructure from extreme weather events, we must also make cybersecurity a core priority. But for today's hearing, I will focus primarily on actions we're taking at DOT to address climate change and resiliency, and how the American Jobs Plan can help us do even more. At DOT, we're supporting the President's aggressive goal of net zero emissions by 2050 by investing in and accelerating a shift to clean transportation, including clean vehicles, airplanes, ships, and transit, as well as making walking and biking safer and easier. Furthermore, we've developed 4 key resiliency strategies. First, build stronger or better, or retrofit existing infrastructure, incorporating nature-based strategies wherever possible. Second, add redundancy and efficiency to the transportation network by building new links, multimodal hubs, or routes. 3, relocate transportation assets to less vulnerable locations. And lastly, use operational strategies to help address disruptions. In addition, Federal Highways and the Federal Transit Administration both offer emergency relief programs and work closely with your states and transit agents to get aid on the ground quickly. We're also partnering with state, local, and tribal agencies to evaluate the climate vulnerabilities of their transportation assets and helping them incorporate resiliency into their planning. And the President's American Jobs Plan is a chance to jumpstart efforts to make transformational investments in projects and approaches that build resilience. One highlight of the plan is a $50 billion investment in infrastructure resilience across a range of sectors, including transportation. The plan also allocates $115 billion for a fix-it-right approach to repairing our roads and bridges, including $20 billion to improve road safety for all users. The plan will decrease greenhouse gas emissions by investing $85 billion in transit and $80 billion in rail, as well as $174 billion to support the adoption of electric vehicles. And it calls for $25 billion for airports and $17 billion for inland waterways and ports. The plan will also improve equity by ensuring that at least 40% of the benefits of climate investments flow to underserved communities who bear the disproportionate effects of transportation pollution. We look forward to working with you to make sure that all the American Jobs Plan investments meet local community needs. The AJP also makes financial sense since the benefits of sound resilience investments can far outweigh the costs. In 2020, the National Institute of Building Sciences found that for every dollar of federal mitigation grants spent to avoid disasters before they happen, we save $6. Investing in a more sustainable, equitable transportation system will create jobs and new American industries and will help us tackle climate change, improve safety, and quality of life. But addressing resilience requires more than money. It requires an interdisciplinary effort and a partnership with you in Congress, with state, local, and tribal leaders, with industry, with scientists and researchers, and with local communities. Thank you for the opportunity to appear today. I'm happy to answer your questions.
Thank you very much. Ms. Repko.
Chairman Schatz, Ranking Member Collins, and members of the subcommittee, I'm pleased to be here today to discuss how GAO's past and ongoing work can help inform options to improve the climate resilience of our transportation infrastructure. The United States invests billions of dollars annually into the nation's surface transportation system, which is critical to the economy and affects the lives of most Americans. However, according to the National Climate Assessment, changes in the climate pose a risk to the safety, efficiency, and reliability of that system. Further, the rising number of natural disasters and increasing reliance on federal assistance by those in affected communities is a key source of federal fiscal exposure. Since 2005, federal funding for disaster assistance has totaled at least $500 billion, and these costs are projected to increase as extreme weather events become more frequent and intense due to climate change. In recognition of this fiscal exposure, GAO has included better managing climate change risks in its high-risk list since 2013. As such, we have recommended enhancing resilience, which includes our ability to plan for, adapt to, and recover from adverse events. Resilience investments up front can reduce the need for more costly steps in the future. This is indeed a situation in which an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. My statement today focuses on steps the federal government could take to improve climate resilience in the nation's transportation infrastructure, including first, following the principles of GAO's disaster resilience framework, and second, considering options specific to the federal aid highway program. First, GAO issued its disaster resilience framework in October 2019. The framework is organized around 3 guiding principles: information, integration, and incentives. For instance, we have found that authoritative and accurate information on disaster risks can help guide decisions that promote resilience. This is particularly relevant in the area of infrastructure, where information on climate trends, such as likely increases in precipitation or temperature, may be critical to making long-term investments. However, the federal government's climate data are fragmented, and no single source of authoritative information exists. We have recommended ways to address this issue, such as by creating a national climate information system. As of December 2020, actions have not been taken to address these recommendations. Similarly, we have found that federal incentives can play a key role in motivating climate resilience efforts. Most of the nation's infrastructure is owned and operated by non-federal actors who face competing priorities when planning projects. the government can help encourage these actors to incorporate resilience through incentivizing them to use design standards based on the best available disaster information. As such, we have recommended that the federal government work to provide better climate information to organizations that set design standards. While some action has been taken on this recommendation, as of April 2021, agencies have not taken sufficient action to address it. Second, GAO's ongoing work offers preliminary insights on options to build greater resilience into the federal aid highway program. These options include integrating resilience into FHWA's policy, guidance, and planning requirements. Other options include establishing formulas to meet climate-related goals, or the use of discretionary grant programs to assist particularly vulnerable roads or populations. Some of these options are similar to those that GAO has recommended in our previous work, and others include actions that FHWA may undertake on its own or those that may require congressional action. Creating the appropriate mix of options to enhance the climate resilience of federally funded roads is not easy. It is a policy choice that requires complex trade-off decisions. However, resilience offers an opportunity to help ensure that federally funded roads can withstand or more easily recover from disasters. Seizing this opportunity can better protect the billions we invest annually in highway infrastructure while also helping reduce our future fiscal exposure. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Collins, and members of the subcommittee, this concludes my prepared statement. I would be pleased to respond to any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Ms. Repko. And now we wish a aloha kakahiaka to my friend Ed Sniffen, calling in from the State of Hawaii Department of Transportation.
Aloha, Chair Schatz, Ranking Member Collins, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you very much for the opportunity to testify regarding climate resiliency and transportation systems. The Hawaii Department of Transportation manages and operates the multimodal systems that serve as the major distribution hub for the Pacific region and lifeline for the state. These systems are surrounded by water, and we're all planning within all modes for greater impacts in the future as sea levels continue to rise. The Hawaii Climate Change Mitigation and Adaptation Commission forecasts that 1 meter of sea level rise will impact the Hawaiian Islands by the year 2100. If we take the traditional approach of relocating transportation facilities, we'd be looking at an estimated $30 billion to move or elevate state roads and bridges, address impacts at airports, and protect the state's commercial harbor facilities. In 2018, we had nearly $100 million in damages from flooding, landslides, hurricanes, earthquakes, and volcanic eruptions that qualified for the Federal Highway Administration Emergency Relief Program. This included the April 2018 flood event on Kauai, when 50 inches of rain fell in the Waipa'a area within a 24-hour period. Facing the reality that these extreme events becoming more extreme more often, and seeing the impacts of climate change on our neighbors in the Compact of Free Association states, Hawaii is compelled to act. Hawaii DOT has completed vulnerability studies, is implementing a 3-tiered approach to mitigating stresses to the system, and is considering resiliency in all of its operations, while reducing energy consumption and greening operations at the same time. This ties into Governor David Ige's direction as he has committed the state to a 100% clean energy goal by 2045. As the chair of AASHTO's Committee on Transportation, System Security, and Resilience, I work with my counterparts across the country to address climate change and energy issues. All state departments of transportation struggle with the resources needed to address resilience in their systems. I respectfully recommend 3 ways this subcommittee has the ability to amplify the transportation resiliency efforts of the states and territories. First, please support increased investment to improve infrastructure resilience through the American Jobs Plan. This can be accomplished through formula programs or discretionary grant programs focused on resiliency, planning, improvements, and adaptation strategies. Additionally, I'm advocating for support of managed relocation to address the needs of underserved and rural communities. Next, support for increased coordination between resource agencies, researchers, and those engaged in day-to-day airport, port, and highways operations on resilience and adaptation. Hawaii DOT's Harbors Division is pursuing funding for a feasibility study in conjunction with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers for use of a lock and dam system at Honolulu Harbor to control water levels. Estimated cost of the joint feasibility study is $3 million. An estimated cost of a lock and dam system would be $3 billion. Highways will work with both agencies to address the impacts to drainage, utilities, and facilities connecting to the harbor. Support for joint projects such as this could provide insight into use of similar systems to protect seaside populations and assets nationally. Finally, I recommend support for expediting the federal project delivery processes so needed resiliency and adaptation projects can be implemented now. Programs can be adapted to be more efficient while maintaining integrity of purpose. For example, programmatic agreements for Endangered Species Act and historic preservation consultation can save months on processing. The American Jobs Plan is a call to action, challenging and empowering the states to identify future impacts, prioritize transformative improvements, be innovative to improve the quality and life of our facilities, and default to proactive action to build our infrastructure to be safer, stronger, and sounder now. To ensure the people and communities we serve can count on their infrastructure and their government to support them for years to come. Thank you again for the honor and opportunity to testify today. I am happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Sniffen. I'll now turn to the ranking member to introduce our next testifier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Habib Dagher is a professional engineer and professor at the University of Maine. He has a PhD in civil and structural engineering. He serves as the founding executive director of the Advanced Structures and Composites Center, a National Science Foundation-funded research center housed in a 100,000 square foot laboratory at the University of Maine. And this center has been a world leader in the development of low-cost, high-performance structural composites for construction. He's also the director of the Transportation Infrastructure Durability Center, a Region 1 university transportation center that the university competed vigorously for, and I was very proud when it was awarded to the university. That is due to Dr. Dagher's great work. And I would note that he has received many, many awards over the year, but I wanted to point out one that he received in 2015. He was the White House Transportation Champion of Change. So there's no one who can give us more insight, in my view, into what's going on at the university level in research and development in the area that is the topic of this hearing. So it's a great honor to have him here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Please proceed, Dr. Dagher.
Dagher, I don't know that you have your mic on, and if you do, if you could pull it closer.
Thank you, Senator Collins, for the wonderful remarks and your leadership on this committee for so many years. Chairman Schatz, Ranking Member Collins, members of the Subcommittee on Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development and related agencies. I'm Habib Dagher, the Executive Director of the...
Sir, could you please bring the microphone closer to your mouth? Thank you.
Yeah. Is this better? Okay. I'm Habib Dagher, the Director of the Advanced Structures and Composites Center at the University of Maine. It's the largest university-based research center in the state of Maine. We conduct research and development on sustainable advanced materials, on structures and construction methods suitable for transportation, housing, and defense applications. We're also preparing the leaders that will take these technologies to the future and implement them. Over the last many years, we financially sponsored over 2,600 engineers who are now working in transportation departments and other places, taking these materials to practice. I also lead the University Transportation Center, funded by the federal DOT, called the Transportation Infrastructure Durability Center. We're conducting currently over 40 research projects across Maine and New England, all aimed at increasing the life of our transportation assets and developing designs for more durable, sustainable, and resilient roads and bridges and port facilities. As you see from the 4 examples I'll provide, investments in R&D, such as university transportation centers, are key to achieving cost-effective, resilient transportation systems of the future. We can't keep building it the same way and expect a different result. As we rebuild our roads and bridges, we have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to use more durable, more sustainable advanced materials, including composites. That's exactly what the Imagine Act, introduced by Senator Collins and White House in March, would facilitate. It would fund research in new materials and building technologies and would spur federal investments in infrastructure projects for innovative materials focused on more durable coastal and rural assets. The Imagine Act also is very critical to maintaining U.S. technological leadership because we are losing it in certain areas, particularly in the advanced materials space. And the stakes are very high. Next year, construction will be worth roughly $1.5 trillion in the U.S., and the construction industry is worth more than 10% of the world GDP. I'm going to show, I have four different examples, specific examples on the ground of how we're making a difference with these material systems. The first is called the bridge in a backpack, and you can see a photo on page 2 of my testimony. These are bridges that are made with arches that are inflated out of a hockey bag right on site and can be infused with a resin. And within 4 hours, they're stronger than steel, and they can be filled with concrete on site. I have right here an example of one of these tubes. Imagine a 70-foot long arch that can be picked up by 2 people. Now, the carbon footprint of these bridges is also about a quarter that of a conventional bridge. The second example is what we call the composite U-girder technology. The U-shaped composite girders are very light. They're about 1/3 to 1/4 the weight of steel, and they pack very well. Actually, you can pack a 280-foot-long bridge on one trailer, one stretch bed, and take it out to site. So when you look at problems of rebuilding after a disaster, being able to pack it light and pack it short and take it out to site is very important, and that's what this project does. And to give you an example, on page 4 of the testimony, I've got a 40-foot shipping container that's packing 4 bridges right in one shipping container. The next example I'd like to cover is on page 6 of my testimony, is how to protect existing coastal assets. We're developing lightweight 3D printed portable breakwaters that you can deploy when the storm arrives. You know the storm's coming, you deploy these around the city, and you protect the coastal assets from the higher waves. We're going to try to do that for the first time this summer in the state of Maine, and we'll let you know how it works. On figure 9, you can show the simulations we've done and the testing we've done on figure 8 and 9 to prove how you can reduce the energy in the waves before it reaches the coast. And finally, I'm going to show you a very simple idea. It's a bio-based 3D printed culvert diffuser. You can place at the end of a culvert that increases the flow by 40%. So when the storm arrives, if you can run more water through a culvert, you can reduce the impact. So the summary here is, please invest in R&D. That's how we're going to build a better transportation infrastructure of the future. Thank you. Happy to answer questions.
Thank you very much to all of our great testifiers. I want to start with Ms. Trottenberg. $8 billion is not nearly enough for DOT's resiliency investments over a 5-year period. There are projects in individual cities that will chew up that entire amount. The city of Houston has requested $60 billion just from this subcommittee. Louisiana has identified $17.6 billion. As Mr. Sniffen reports, Hawaii's airports alone could chew up $8 billion. So how should we understand $8 billion over 5 years if you're serious about these resiliency efforts? And I know you are, but the dollar amount seems like more of a placeholder than anything else, and I'm wondering if you could speak to that.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Mr. Chairman. And just to contextualize, I think as I said in my testimony, the American Jobs Plan is actually talking about a transportation infrastructure investment of over $600 billion, and resiliency is going to be baked into a lot of different components of those investments. The $100+ billion in highways, the $80 billion in transit. So it will be in part baked into those figures. I think we have also proposed a separate $40 billion across different types of infrastructure resiliency program. But I think as the president has made clear, and we're seeing this week, this is obviously a proposal we're ready to sit down and negotiate with Congress on, and I think a lot of good bipartisan discussions are going. I think this is an administration that certainly wants to make big investments in resiliency.
That's all I wanted to hear. And I take the point that it'll be integrated across all existing programs, but as you know, the Federal Highways Program in particular gives a ton of discretion to the local transportation agencies, and that, that's a good thing if you're the local transportation agency, but if you're trying to drive federal policy as it relates to climate resilience, then that worries me a bit, because you could plus up the highway fund all you want and say that there's, there are new opportunities for resiliency, but it may end up just being that you do the sort of souped up FAST Act with some climate aspects, and that's not where we're trying to land. And so we're going to have to sort of wrangle over this over the next several months.
Certainly, Mr. Chairman, you are absolutely right. It can't just be dollars. There has to be good policy that goes with that to make sure those dollars are spent really wisely.
Thank you. Mr. Sniffen, the DOT allows resiliency features in the Highway Emergency Relief Program on a limited basis, and the Hawaii Department of Transportation has been successful on this front. What are you doing differently that gets these projects approved, and how can this process be sort of scaled nationwide?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. Our federal highways partners in Hawaii are tremendous. They work with us directly to ensure that we can justify the cost benefits of upgrading our facilities during our emergency responses. We do a really good job of ensuring that we provide all the information necessary for federal highways to be able to justify up on any decisions that they make. Federal Highways, through our ASTRO committee, has been working with us to address this issue nationwide. They understand that this policy is being applied differently across the nation. And from the state side, we understand that some states are not providing the information that we need to be able to justify these discussions. We're working directly with them to put in a series of webinars to ensure that all states and all federal partners across the board understand the intent of the law, the intent of the program, and how to use it.
Thank you, Mr. Sniffen. I'm sort of torn between being very pleased that we, in particular, have a great Hawaii State Department of Transportation and a great partnership with our federal government, but that's not scalable, and it shouldn't depend on having, extraordinary leaders at both the state and federal level. We should make policy to make sure that this happens, regardless of who's in charge of the state government in a particular place, and regardless of the sort of the good relationship or not. So I look forward to talking to you a little bit longer, Mr. Sniffen, about what you're doing right, but more importantly, how to replicate this across the country, not just through webinars, but through statutory law. Dr. Duggar, fascinating testimony. If you could give us one piece of advice as it relates to the Federal Department of Transportation being nimble enough to accommodate all of this new technology, what would that piece of advice be?
I think the ability to take the transportation centers currently being funded by the DOT and extend them so they can apply their work to the infrastructure. And that can be done by creating grant programs for demonstration projects that take all these wonderful ideas and put them into practice.
Thank you very much. Senator Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Duggar, I look forward to attending the upcoming ribbon cutting at the Gristmill Bridge, which is a 75-foot single-span bridge in Hamden, Maine. And it's my understanding this bridge is the first in the nation to use composite girders with no concrete reinforcement in the structure, no concrete reinforcement in the structure. Could you explain the environmental impacts of this bridge? And also, is this bridge going to last longer than the average bridge?
Yes, thank you, Senator Collins. This particular technology packs small, packs light, and can be deployed very easily, very quickly. We don't need heavy equipment to build a bridge, and that reduces its environmental footprint significantly. You can use almost rental cranes locally to erect some of these bridges because they're so light. So the advantage also is they last longer. So they're designed for a 100-year life. So anytime you increase the life, everything else being equal, you reduce your carbon footprint significantly. So doubling the life reduces the carbon footprint by a factor of 2, everything else being equal.
Thank you. I think that's a great example of the work being done at the University of Maine's Composite Center that is right on point for the subject of this hearing, a bridge that lasts longer and has less of a carbon footprint. Secretary Trottenberg, I want to talk to you a little bit about the Colonial Pipeline disaster, the cyber attack. FISMA within your department is responsible for the safety oversight of pipelines. I realize there's a role at DHS and the Department of Energy as well, but I would like to know whether the department, the agency within your department, has any standards for cybersecurity for pipelines, and whether you would support a mandatory reporting requirement so when there is a cyber attack like this, there would be a requirement that it be reported to the federal government. This was not an issue in this particular case, but could be in others.
I mean, thanks, Senator. It's a good question. And look, what we've seen with the cyber attack on the Colonial Pipeline has showed us kind of the two worlds coming together, cybersecurity and physical infrastructure. The Biden administration has brought a whole of government approach, and I think we've obviously made some real progress in making sure we're getting oil where it needs to go. The pipeline is up and running again as of last night. Our agency is working very closely with DHS, Department of Defense, Department of Energy, I think, to look into this incident, to think closely about what we might do in the future. But DHS takes the lead on cybersecurity. And Senator, I think you raise a good issue here, which is obviously this is a privately owned pipeline. A lot of our infrastructure is privately owned and operated. And not only do all the government agencies need to be working together, but we need to be working closely with the private sector as well.
That last point is a very important one. 85% of our critical infrastructure is owned and operated by the private sector, and that's why I think we do need mandatory reporting and more cooperation between the public and private sectors. Let me follow up with you also about a point that was in Mr. Sniffin's written testimony, and he talked about the need to expedite the process so that we can deliver federal projects more quickly. Is the administration going to propose any changes in the permitting process so that we can expedite these important projects?
I think, Senator, as you know, this has been, I think, a good subject of discussion and negotiation presently as, the White House is talking to some of your colleagues about a reauthorization bill. I think there is a real desire on both sides of the aisle to do a better job on the permitting, on project delivery. It's great to be here with some colleagues who I think have come up with some great innovations in how we can deliver projects faster, we can deliver them at a lower cost, we can be more innovative. I think the administration is keen to work with you all on better ways to do that. The permitting process is one that has grown, in some cases very complex and costly, and we can make improvements while also maintaining environmental protections and all the things that the process is designed to address.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Collins. I just add very quickly on that, programmatic environmental review is, in my view, one of the sweet spots, maintaining the integrity of NEPA, but making things work a little bit better. Senator Coons. I'm sorry, we now have Senator Reed virtually.
Senator Reed is used to my calling on him.
Senator Collins, did you want us? I think we have technical difficulties, and he is pending. Senator Coons.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to question. Welcome, Chairman Schatz, Ranking Member Collins. So great to be with you for this first hearing of this Congress on hard infrastructure at the THUD subcommittee. And thank you to our 4 amazing witnesses. I followed your testimony closely, and I think this is an urgent and significant issue that we're talking about. Obviously, I also appreciate the focus not just by our committee, but by the Biden administration on the impact of climate change on our nation's transportation infrastructure. As we've heard, whether it's the states of Hawaii or Maine or also my home state of Delaware, there are places all over our nation that face significant risks from climate change. Delaware happens to be the lowest mean elevation state in the whole country, and because of subsidence, we face a greater risk from sea level rise than many other states. We also happen to be at a critical choke point in one of our nation's most critical pieces of transportation infrastructure, the 450-mile Northeast Corridor, which runs from New England to Washington, D.C., is an absolutely critical lifeline for the mid-Atlantic and Northeast of our country. Pre-pandemic, it carried 12 million passengers every year, and a single day without service on the NEC would cost the economy $100 million. Ms. Trottenberg, as you certainly know from your time in New York City, dealing with the post-Sandy recovery, big storms pose a greater and greater threat every year to the Northeast Corridor, and Amtrak's assets all up and down the East Coast, and certainly my home state of Delaware, are vulnerable to storm surges and sea level rise. In 2017, Amtrak completed a study on the vulnerabilities of a specific 10-mile section of track in Wilmington, Delaware, and discovered half of that segment is highly vulnerable to flooding and could result in a total shutdown because there's no alternate route. It is a single path. So, Ms. Trottenberg, if you might, why should the federal government invest in making the Northeast Corridor more resilient to flooding from sea level rise and storm surges? I'm pleased that President Biden's American Jobs Plan includes $80 billion for Amtrak. I'd be interested in hearing what DOT is doing to prepare the NEC for climate change and how that AJP investment would scale those efforts.
Thank you for that question, Senator. And in some ways, I think your question answers itself a bit. I mean, obviously, the Northeast Corridor...
It's called leading the witness, ma'am.
I mean, the Northeast Corridor is a critical transportation link. And you're correct, you know, having been on the ground in New York City and seen the damage that Sandy did in the Hudson River tunnels, but did also in a number of transit tunnels and roadway tunnels. Once salt water intrudes in a tunnel, the damage is extensive and very costly. And you know, clearly, given what an important lifeline the Northeast Corridor is, making some major investments, I think in the long run, as I think all of us have emphasized in our testimony, will save us down the road. This is a lifeline we absolutely need to maintain. And, you know, as you mentioned, Senator, unfortunately, parts of the Northeast Corridor are pretty much at sea level.
Well, and as you mentioned in your testimony, investing in infrastructure that can't withstand climate change is throwing good money after bad. And as someone who routinely commutes back and forth from Wilmington to Washington, I'm very conscious that I go through a tunnel in Baltimore that was built in the 1870s and over bridges that are a century old, all of which are right along the very edge of our coastline. Acting Director Repko, if I might, in your testimony, you highlight DelDOT's, the Delaware Department of Transportation's work to improve climate resilience. And I think on page 11 of your testimony, there's a graphic demonstration. Those who've ever been to Dewey Beach, Delaware, and I hope it's a lot of the folks in the room, at least amongst the staff, if not the members, it is one of the favorite places of folks from Washington to go in the summers. You show how a major investment in Route 1, which connects Delaware up and down the whole coastline, is vulnerable to regular flooding, and how it's relatively easy to deal with the stormwater drainage there through it at that access point. How can Congress empower more states to improve climate resilience on federally funded highway projects like that Route 1 project in Delaware?
Thank you, Senator. And I think it's important to note that states and locals are the folks who are implementing. They're usually working at the project level. So we see a federal role being at the programmatic level. And that's really where the disaster resilience framework comes in. We want to think about giving the right information and consistent information to folks. If the federal government can serve an integrative function, that is that it can reduce the challenges related to coordination, not have several funding streams with different time frames or different goals coming at people. And also, if it can provide incentives. You know, there's incentives that the federal government can do related to reducing administrative burdens. There's incentives that the federal government can do in the testimony we present related to roads. You know, could be options related to discretionary funding or options related to design standards. All of that is a key federal role that could help push states forward in building resilience.
Well, thank you. If I might, one last question, Mr. Chairman. I think what I'm hearing from you, what we also heard from Deputy Director Sniffen, is that the interface between state departments of transportation and the federal Department of Transportation needs some innovation, needs some flexibility if we're going to deal with climate change. If I might, I'm turning to Dr. Dar for my last question. The University of Delaware also does some cutting-edge composite research. Certainly the University of Maine's Institute is one of the nation's leading, if not the world's leading. I thought the New York Times article, The Totally Tubular, was fabulous, and I would love to follow up with you about the innovations that are being delivered, not just developed, but delivered in Maine in terms of infrastructure relying on composites is fascinating. Could you just briefly tell us what more we could be doing to take the kinds of cutting-edge research that you're doing in composites and materials and actually see it deployed at scale in our nation's infrastructure to make it more resilient?
Thank you, Senator Coons. This is an excellent question. I think the important thing when you bring in new materials into the infrastructure, that costs more to start with. So oftentimes they get set aside.
Right.
However, if you start looking at life cycle analysis of these systems, whether it's due to resiliency, reducing the carbon footprint, if we can start implementing life cycle analysis more in our transportation infrastructure planning systems, that's when the new materials start to shine.
I spent a decade as a county elected responsible for our county sewer system and discovered that our wonderful engineers were very cautious and not very good at life cycle costing, and so innovations were slow to be adopted. I'd love to work with you and with your great colleague from Maine more on that. I appreciate your referencing the Climate Solutions Caucus in your introduction. And the last piece of climate resiliency I'll mention before I close, Mr. Chairman, is the Civilian Climate Corps. We just introduced legislation to authorize it. It would put to work thousands and thousands of young Americans in doing the kind of natural solutions to provide resilient infrastructure work that we need done, so the human side as well as the material side. Thank you so much for the chance to question several of our witnesses today, Mr. Chairman. Congratulations on your first hearing as chair.
Thank you, Senator Coons. Senator Bozeman.
Thank you, Chairman Schatz and Ranking Member Collins, for having this important hearing. And again, congratulations on your new assignment posting. I know that you and Ranking Member Collins are going to be a great team. We miss you at VA MilCon, but like I said, I know you're going to do a great job and look forward to working with both of you, continue to working with you on such important issues. So congratulations.
Thank you.
Secretary Trottenberg, we have a situation in Memphis, the Memphis Bridge. I think it's a great example that we do have significant infrastructure problems in our country. And this has come about, as you know, in the last few days where we've actually had to close the bridge. This is a very, very high trafficked corridor. 30% of the vehicles that go are commerce related. Actually had to close the river as a result of this. So it really is a high stakes thing. One thing that I'd really like for you to look at is if we could use a model like we used in Minnesota, where we, actually that bridge collapsed and we were able to rebuild it, in around a year, where it normally would have probably taken 15 years by the agencies working together. Not the gotcha attitude, but the attitude of how can we help, how can we facilitate things. So I know that you're going to be doing that, but I would just emphasize how important that is, not only to that region of the country, it being a north-south corridor, but really for the entire country.
Thank you, Senator Bozeman. And certainly we have been following what's happening and in communication, I think, with the DOTs in Arkansas and Tennessee, and recognizing it's affecting vehicular traffic and barge traffic. So,
right.
Stand ready to work with you and, see what solutions we can come up with quickly as possible. We agree. It's a very critical situation for a very important route.
Right. Well, we appreciate your help and again, appreciate your staff's help that does a very, very good job. certainly green infrastructure has a place in, as we go forward in constructing new infrastructure, taking care of the old. I think we have to be really careful, though, about a one-size-fits-all approach. Sometimes we get ourselves in that situation. Communities need to do rigorous analysis of the cost and benefits of installing various technologies and decide for themselves the most appropriate course of action. As we seek to build transportation assets that are more resilient, states and communities are looking at the interaction of different project features to improve resiliency. As part of this, would you agree there is a role for both gray and green infrastructure going forward? And can you explain your reasoning in that regard?
Couldn't agree more, Senator. I mean, there is absolutely a no one size fits all. And, certainly I can just speak a little bit from my recent experience in New York City to sort of retrofit, major urban infrastructure is very, very complicated. And, there are places where you can have green solutions, but that's certainly not going to work everywhere. In places where you can use those green or nature-based solutions, it can often be not only less expensive, but potentially offer some co-benefits. If you're shoring up a shoreline, it might provide beach or fishing or other recreational opportunities, but there is no one-size-fits-all. And certainly, Senator, I think you're right. Local communities obviously have to have a big role in figuring out how to do this. And I can at least speak from the New York City point of view, it's not easy. Coming up with the right estimates of costs and benefits, which technologies to use, requires, I think, a lot of good analysis and a lot of expertise.
One of the areas that I think that we've been successful in reducing greenhouse gas emissions are our bus fleets that use natural gas. In Arkansas, the Rock Region Metro operates 58 buses along 26 routes each week using compressed natural gas. The remaining buses that are powered by diesel, but those will be converted by 2025. Can you talk a little bit about the place for natural gas vehicles? And it does make sense, like I say, some of the huge gains that we've made so far have been in that area. And how does DOT plan to ensure local transit agencies can receive funding for the types of vehicles that meet their unique needs of the area?
I apologize, Senator. There was sort of a strange electronic noise, and you faded out there just at the end of your question.
Well, I said, how does DOT plan to ensure that these areas that are using things like natural gas going forward, how can you meet their needs? Arkansas is blessed with a lot of natural gas. It's kind of a no-brainer to use that technology and that fuel.
I mean, I think, again, it's no secret that the administration, look, we're seeking as best we can to get to a zero emissions transportation system by 2050. There are a lot of different ways to get there. Clearly, one focus of this administration is going to be electrification, but of course, we're looking, at different regions and different cities that are using different solutions that can help us get there. We're not going to electrify overnight. But, we certainly want to work on the ground, particularly with local transit systems, as, bus fleets can take 15, 20 years to turn over. Right. So as you're working through new technologies and new procurements, we want to work with you to try and find the way to make that fleet as green as possible.
Thank you very much. We appreciate you.
Thank you.
I understand Senator Reed may be available online. He's chairing an Armed Services Committee, so it's unclear whether he's available at the moment. Senator Reed? If not, Senator Murphy. Do we have Senator Capito online? Okay, I'll move on to my own questions as we work out who is available online. Oh, Senator Murphy, are you ready for your questions? I can vamp for a moment. Here you go. All right. Secretary Trottenberg, your testimony highlights that 40% of the climate investments in the American Jobs Plan will flow to underserved communities. How do you make sure that the states meet this goal given the discretion that they have under our current statute?
It's a good question, and I want to just emphasize that 40%, to be clear, I think sometimes people hear it and they think we're just talking about perhaps urban areas, but underserved communities can be rural areas, tribal areas. I think there are a lot of different parts of the country that we envision these investments could really help, parts of the country that have perhaps not shared in the prosperity that the rest of the country has. So I think there, just to be clear, sort of a broad definition of those underserved communities. And I think part of our work together with Congress as we craft reauthorization and American Jobs Plan legislation is to find how we can, sort of bake in that very important priority. And I think it can be done in a number of ways, through how formula funds flow and discretionary funds where there are contracting opportunities. I think there are a variety of ways that we can make sure that underserved communities get the benefits of the investments of federal dollars and the climate and mobility and equity benefits that flow from those investments.
Thank you. Ms. Repko, GAO issued a disaster resiliency framework to serve as a guide for the federal government's response to disasters. What weaknesses did you find in the coordination of disaster recovery efforts between DOT and FEMA, and what are the recommendations to remedy those weaknesses?
Thank you, Senator. Broadly, coordination has been a challenge that we've looked at across all of our disaster recovery work. You find it between states, locals, tribes, territories, expressing a lot of frustrations about how to coordinate things, specifically related to DOT and FEMA. Our 2017 work on the 2017 hurricanes found that there were coordination issues, some duplicate payments where DOT and FEMA paid applicants for the same expense. It was a small amount. We've made recommendations that they've adopted to change that, but I think it shows that coordination is really a challenge in these situations. And, I'd go back to the disaster resilience framework as a way that the federal government could help here. Think about integration. Think about how we can coordinate these programs. Think about how they can be on similar timeframes, that there can be one place where people can go to ask questions, because you don't want to create more challenges for states and locals in an already challenging situation.
Thank you very much. We'll now move on to Senator Braun.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Last Congress, this question is for Secretary Trottenberg, the EPW committee passed the largest infrastructure bill in history. It provided $287 billion in funding over 5 years, had several new provisions promoting resilient infrastructure. Question: the original authorization of the FAST Act expired in 2020 and was extended through this summer, and Congress has got to reauthorize it again this year. Why was a reauthorization not included in the President's infrastructure bill?
Thank you for that question, Senator. And I think, as you know, the American Jobs Plan admittedly was sort of assuming a reauthorization and was a proposal that would go above and beyond that. But really, I think the administration is operating on two tracks. We're putting forward our American Jobs Plan, but also, and Senator Capito has just entered the room, I think the President is in earnest discussions with some of your colleagues on both sides of the aisle about what a potential reauthorization bill would look like. So I think we're pursuing both tracks.
So I think it'd be good, even though we're pursuing both tracks, to make the one a certainty, because we don't know how the bigger shot in the arm is going to pan out. Also begs the question, back in 2017 in Indiana, and you've got states that I think are actually doing a more responsible job for their share of infrastructure because they're pinning it to a definitive source of funding. Then we got stakeholders throughout our state, mostly businesses, ended up raising the diesel tax by 20 cents a gallon, gas by 10, put us a 5-year stream of income out there that was dependable. And the only thing dependable here that I can see is that we're going to be borrowing money for the host of things that are out there. We never really had that point of view on infrastructure. We always kind of had it dedicated. And I think the last time there's been any adjustment to the dedicated source of funding has been 1993. Couple ideas. Maybe that ought to be looked at again, even though most Hoosiers wanted better infrastructure, didn't want their taxes to go up. That's common on anything, but it took political will, and even for somebody like myself as a fiscal conservative, to sell it. We did get 48 out of 50 of stakeholders that said, yes, if you'll spend it on roads and bridges, not a host of other things. Our fuel tax, our sales tax on fuel was being spent for everything else. We brought all 7% of that back to roads and bridges as well. Where you at on getting a dependable stream on a tangible thing like infrastructure, rather than this idea that we can keep borrowing out of the general fund when we used to do it otherwise?
Thank you. And look, Senator, it's no secret we have struggled here in Washington for several decades now to sort of come together on a sustainable revenue source. And you all know here in Congress in the past 10 years, we have added a lot of general funds into the Highway Trust Fund. The gap between expenditures and what we're taking in is now around $10 billion a year. Admittedly, I think that there's perhaps a difference of opinion about where we go from here. The administration has proposed a corporate tax rate increase, although I think the president has signaled that, it's something he's certainly open to negotiations on. He has not supported something like a raise in the gas tax. He's not wanting to see, taxes go up on middle-class families. But again, I think he's signaled certainly a readiness to engage with you all on that hardy, challenging question.
So would you want to be on record today to do what we did back in Indiana, to raise diesel taxes by 20 cents a gallon and gas by 10?
I would not be on the record on that. Again, I'll follow the lead of the president that he has made his corporate tax proposals, but again, signaled a willingness, I think, to negotiate and engage with you all.
I brought this up in another infrastructure discussion, and I think it's worthy of consideration too. The federal balance sheet, I wrestled with Chairman Sanders on the floor last night about it, is as bad as it's ever been. We're in debt way more deeply than we were coming out of World War II. I cited then we were savers and investors. We're generally spenders and consumers now. Would you consider states, they live within balanced budgets, generally have rainy day funds, plan ahead, make those tough decisions? What about giving more federal dollars to states that would actually carry a heavier share than their conventional 20%? Is that an idea you think would maybe be a way to stretch the federal dollar? Skin in the game for states.
Right. We actually, I think, already do that more on the transit side of the ledger. When you look at the CIG program, sort of the local share is, one of the factors. And, typically in transit projects, the local share is going to be more than 20%. We've done less of that on the highway side. Certainly, I think those are discussions. I know that sort of were live here in the last administration, and again, certainly worth looking at. I think as an administration, we think skin in the game is important.
Thank you, and I consider that on roads and bridges as well. So, thank you.
Senator Murphy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the hearing. I actually want to pick up where Senator Braun left off because I have a similar concern. You had I think a dialogue earlier with Senator Coons about the Northeast Rail Corridor, which is perpetually at flood risk. We've got a 10-year-old train station in Branford, Connecticut, that has a sign posted outside of it, parking area prone to flooding. And there are lots of days where you can't get into that parking lot. You can't access the trains because it's underwater, and there's been exhaustive studies about the vulnerability of the entire line, given that so much of it rests, especially in Connecticut, right along the water. But to Senator Braun's point, I want to make sure that when it comes to what may be a historic investment in the Northeast Corridor, that we ask states to do their fair share. Listen, I think we've got a once-in-a-lifetime chance to be able to adapt the rail line for climate, but also to be able to improve the experience of riders. And I'm going to support as big an appropriation as possible, but I think it'd be a lot easier to get bipartisan support and taxpayer buy-in with respect to the rail investment if we find some mechanisms to get state buy-in. And this is a little different than transit. Obviously, the jobs plan has a transit component to it, but then it has a specific Amtrak component to it. And just by virtue of the fact that the busiest stretch of Amtrak is in the Northeast, much of that funding will find its way to our area. So I'll ask this question in the frame of resiliency, because much of the money for Amtrak will be used to build resiliency. And maybe it's the same answer as you had for Senator Braun, but how do we make sure that that Amtrak money, which is going to be spent in part on resiliency, leverages state buy-in and doesn't just replace state expenditures or state partnerships with Amtrak to improve the reliability of the line?
Very important question. And I do just want to make clear, I think the, excuse me, the proposal for rail funding, although certainly a good portion of it would go for the Northeast Corridor, it is certainly envisioned that we would be making rail investments all over the country. Just want to be clear on that point. And look, a good example that I know you're very familiar with, Senator, what we're doing on the Hudson River Tunnel, which is so important for the whole Northeast Corridor line, and certainly, calling on both New York State and New Jersey to be, financial participants and real partners at the table, and that is clearly a model. And as you know, in recent years, Amtrak and the states have worked out, a more thoughtful set of cost-sharing relationships. So I think there's some good templates in place there. We should be force multipliers, federal dollars and state dollars as well.
Great. Second question, I'll direct this to you. Ms. Repko would love the Secretary's input as well. On the topic of what is referred to as green infrastructure, the idea that you can use dunes and wetlands and oyster reefs to protect shorelines from flooding. Now Vice President Harris and I had a piece of legislation called the Living Shorelines Act, which would try to incentivize both state and local and federal funding into these kind of projects. And my sense is that we're really good at building gray infrastructure, hard infrastructure, because green infrastructure like reefs or dunes, just don't have as much engineering experience behind them, that it's a little bit harder to imagine because you don't have as many folks who have done them. But they provide enormous benefit because they're helping to protect shorelines, but they're, also doing a pretty good job at enhancing ecosystems and protecting habitats. So I don't know if any of your sort of work has revolved around this issue of how you incentivize green infrastructure, and I'd certainly love the Secretary's input on whether the department has thought about how to promote those kind of projects.
Thank you for the question, Senator. One of the examples that we do cite is more of a green infrastructure project that's happening in Delaware. I think that really the federal government has certain levers that they can pull as it relates to disaster resilience. And some of that relates to information, which I think is very important, having a set of climate information that is consistent, that folks at the state and local government can use to make their projections, and also having design standards. Those are two open recommendations that we have. Because at the federal government, again, we don't build as much. We give a lot of this to the states. We need to give them a roadmap that helps them get to a place that's easier. Folks have been doing other infrastructure projects that didn't have resilience in it for years. They do have experience with that. We need to make it easier for them to make this shift.
I'm over my time, Mr. Chairman, but those design standards are something that I think would be really important to think about, especially for these projects that happen with less frequency but have pretty tremendous upside. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Murphy. Senator Capito.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here today. And I'm sorry I wasn't here for the beginning of the remarks. So if this has already been covered, I apologize for that. You know, we talk about mitigation and building back better and mitigating natural disasters, and we have two folks testifying, one from Maine, one from Hawaii, very different types of disasters. Well, I'm from West Virginia, and, you know, we're not going to have a tsunami. Well, if we do, we're all gone, but in West Virginia. But we do have very drastic and very devastating floods. We had a flood in 2016 that killed 23 people. It was very rapid, very sad. So I guess I'd like to ask first Ms. Repko, and by the way, I know your sister and she's doing a great job. What unique challenges, how do you formulate, or let me start with you, Ms. Trottenberg. How do you formulate different resiliency strategies when there's so many different types of disasters for different types of terrains, for different types of folks? Isn't that where we ought to really empower our states more, maybe, and is that what you're doing presently?
It's a great question, and you're absolutely right. You know, we talk a lot about coastal areas, but you are certainly right. In West Virginia, Vermont, other places, devastating flooding. Absolutely, it's empowering states, it's empowering localities. It's, as I said in my testimony, really interdisciplinary. I don't think anyone part of government holds all the answers. You know, a lot of these projects are very complicated. You know, as Senator Murphy was asking about things like sort of different green infrastructure, that often pulls in not just traditional transportation agencies, but environmental agencies. So I think it has to be quite an interdisciplinary partnership to get it right. And, you know, I think a DOT between Federal Highways and Federal Transit, we're trying very much to work with local partners on the ground, but, you know, we also need feedback in ways that we can do that better and be more tailored in our solutions.
Yeah, thank you. Ms. Repko?
Absolutely agree with you. I think one thing that's important to think about is that resilience is not one thing. And I think sometimes people want to think, oh, define resilience. What is that? It's site-specific, it's condition-specific, it's project-specific, depending on how long of an investment we're thinking of having. And absolutely, I think that we envision, through the disaster resilience framework, having the federal government play a role where you empower states and locals, you help them coordinate, you provide incentives, such as reducing administrative costs, to be able to build these projects.
Thank you. Dr. Dagher, let me ask you this. I think one of the daunting challenges here is that there is a perception, and it may be real, that building to resilience and using green building practices is more expensive, exponentially more expensive. And I know you're from Maine and obviously deal with that, but you also do a lot with composites. Is there any way that you can help me with that perception? Because I think that would help formulate policy better if you didn't feel like, well, we're going to be spending three times as much on this rebuild, and are we going to get back, you know, the investment that we have? Do you have any perspectives on that?
Excellent question. Thank you for asking that. If you look at the decisions that we make in terms of whether we rebuild the bridge or rebuild it a bit better, there's simple examples that will show you that you can save a lot of money. For example, if you could figure out that these 5 bridges are in the flood zone and next time around they might be washed away, spending some money to raise them a little bit rather than wait until they get washed away is an example where investing in a long-term solution saves money. Data has shown actually, and it's been cited a little earlier, that you can save almost $6 for every dollar you spend on resiliency under certain conditions and certain. In Maine, for example, and in our transportation center, we're looking at working with Vermont right now to look at the flooding that's taken place in their bridges and studying the watersheds and identifying which bridges are next to go if there's another storm. And we're focusing on these bridges and investing in them so that we can focus the investment, yet have the biggest bang for the buck.
Well, I'm glad you brought up bridges, because this is we have so many deficient bridges throughout the country, and certainly in my small state we have so many bridges, and so many of them are well, they're safe, but they're deteriorating. And so that's part of what we're trying to work on in the highway bill as we work through that. But thank you all very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank all of you for your testimony. I think we all recognize that we have to focus on stopping climate change and the huge disruptive impact and costs of climate change. But I want to thank the chairman and ranking member for holding this hearing, because at the same time we do have to deal with the resilience piece, because we're already experiencing the costs of climate change, and if we don't adapt, we will both lose more lives than necessary, and we also will waste a lot of taxpayer dollars in the process. We've seen from this attack on the Colonial Pipeline that we have to harden our cyber infrastructure. We have to make sure we harden our other infrastructure. And in the Obama administration, they adopted a federal flood risk management standard. And Ms. Repko, you mentioned the earlier reports. In the 2019 GAO report, GAO wrote this: additionally, we have reported that implementing the January 2015 federal flood risk management standard, which required all future federal investments in and affecting floodplains to meet a certain elevation level, would have enhanced federal flood resilience by ensuring agencies addressed current and future flood risk. I assume GAO still holds that position. Is that right?
Thank you, Senator. You know, part of the disaster resilience framework is you want to have the best information that you can have about disaster risk and climate risk, and you want to have design standards that builds to that.
Right, and that's what those standards did, isn't that right?
Yes.
And as you point out in this 2019 report, and I'm just quoting, however, since Executive Order 13807 was rescinded in August 2017, the federal government has not taken any further action as of December 2020. So the Trump administration rescinded the executive order that had been put in place by the Obama administration. In fact, the chairman, Senator Schatz and Senator Booker and I then introduced legislation here in Congress to codify that rule. We introduced it last year. My hope is, and we do intend to reintroduce that, but my hope is that the administration can move forward. So Deputy Secretary Trottenberg, I'm just reading from a piece that's probably you saw. It's just, New York Times piece, and it points out that on the first day of, new presidency, the president said he was going to reinstate this Obama rule to save taxpayer dollars, but that the administration reversed itself last month, saying that Mr. Biden's order did not, in fact, reinstate the flood rule, and that no reason was given. I'm hoping maybe today you can provide a reason and also assure us that the administration will reinstate that rule.
I think I'll be cautious in giving a reason. I'm well aware, having served in the Obama administration, the significance of that rule and what happened in the last administration. I think I'd like to come back to you, Senator, with a little more, clarity on what this administration's plans are going to be on that front.
I'd appreciate that, because you would agree, you were part of the previous administration, you would agree that this was a smart policy to implement, would you not?
Yes.
Yeah. It's a little confusing why this has not happened already. So I do intend to move forward with the legislation, but hopefully that will be more of an insurance policy, and also make sure that future administrations, can't just reverse what has happened. Could you talk a little bit about how the federal government can use its tools to leverage states and local jurisdictions to also contribute to this effort? The chairman pointed out in his opening remarks the huge cost of doing this, right? And pointed out that, the proposal from the president, it's good. It's a lot better than where we are, but it's not nearly sufficient. So we have to leverage both state and private sector funding. Can you just talk briefly about some ideas for how we might use that leverage at the federal level?
You are right, Senator. The costs are large. And, in part, I think I'm hearing from some of my fellow panelists today, part of the challenge is making sure that we sort of get the math right, that we're doing the right benefit cost analysis, that we're picking the projects that really make sense, that bring the sort of the benefits you were mentioning, a 6-to-1 ratio, that those investments are smart. But you're also right, and some of your colleagues have mentioned it today. You know, we always, I think, want with federal dollars to try and incentivize, as you point out, not just state and local partners, but private partners to come to the table as well. And that means, I think, we have to work in real partnership also. Obviously, we have to, you know, bring our expertise and our incentives to the table, but you know, respect our partners and take their views and their priorities as well. You know, certainly the Colonial Pipeline is a good, you know, a good sort of perhaps learning experience for us, and is going to make us, I think in some new ways about particularly how we do how we partner with private sectors, owners and operators of infrastructure, because they are an enormous piece of the puzzle here. They don't necessarily get federal funds, but we need to be working more closely with them.
Thank you. And I appreciate it if you can get back to me on the reinstatement of the Obama flood standard.
We'll do, Senator.
Thank you.
Senator Hoeven.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To Deputy Secretary Trottenberg, in North Dakota, we have the Theodore Roosevelt National Park, and in the south unit of the park, we have what we call the scenic loop. It's about a 23-mile loop going through the park, and you can see bison and you know, wild horses and just all different kind of wildlife, and it's very scenic and very beautiful. Because of the badlands out there and the buttes and the amazing topography, section of that road has slid down the side of the canyon, basically, or the side of the butte, I should say. We work with Secretary Bernhardt to get going on restoration of that road, but it's very important because that's such a beautiful scenic loop and so many visitors use it every year. Right now, it's under design. It's in the design phase. So the Central Federal Lands Highway Division of the Federal Highway Administration is working with the Park Service. They're designing it. They hope to have that design done by the end of the year, but we need to get it repaired as soon as we can because it's so integral to the park. So I guess my question is, when there's road reconstruction projects such as the one that I've just described, where there's minimal to no excavation, minimal disturbance, and a pre-existing right-of-way, how can DOT, EPA, and other federal agencies work together to streamline the regulatory process and get this fixed as soon as possible?
Thank you, Senator. And I am aware of that project and the importance of it. And look, we certainly try in projects as you're describing where sort of there's minimal change in the footprint and the design to use categorical exclusions. We also try and do that for projects involved in emergency relief. I think sounds like here we have some of our sister agencies involved, and you know, happy again to follow up with you all. You know, again, have been briefed on the importance of that project and certainly want to make sure we get it right, but do it quickly.
Well, thank you. And your answer actually anticipated my very next question, is that, you know, will you work with my office to make sure that we're coordinating and doing that as rapidly as possible, so hopefully we can get it completed by next year?
Yes, happy to do so.
Thank you. Also, Senator Ron Wyden, who chairs the Finance Committee, and I have the Move America Act, which would be a very good candidate to be part of the infrastructure package. Essentially, it allows states to use private activity bonds for tax-exempt financing, or actually they can use a tax credit to draw equity investors in to really leverage federal funding for infrastructure. And so I guess my question, do you think there's a role for private sector to play in addressing the infrastructure needs through something like the Move America program?
I mean, certainly do, and thank you. I know you and Senator Wyden and others here in Congress have had some very creative ideas on that front. You know, DOT, we have our Build America Bureau, and we, you know, out of that we run our credit programs, and I think we're always looking for more creative and innovative ways that we can bring private investment, you know, into our infrastructure. As we were saying earlier in this hearing, the private sector has a big role to play here. A lot of our infrastructure is privately owned and operated, and they can be great partners in some of these projects.
Thank you. And if you would even expand on that a little bit with P3, one of the P3 projects we're doing right now is the Red River Valley Flood Protection Project, which is actually a multi-state project between North Dakota, Minnesota, the Red River of the North. And it's about a $3 billion project, but actually the federal cost share is only 35% because we're using P3 and a lot of it will be done. It's a state, local, state, federal partnership along with the private sector, which is expediting the construction. We hope to have it done in 6 years and reducing the federal cost share to only 35%. So talk for a minute about your feelings in regard to using P3, public-private partnerships, as we undertake our infrastructure needs.
I mean, I think that's a great example, and there are certainly places, we've seen them all over the country, where, you know, bringing in a private sector partner can reduce the public share. I will just say, you know, I want to be cautious. One thing we do often hear, for example, in some rural areas is, you know, those deals can be complicated to put together. There aren't necessarily the revenue streams that bring the private sector partners to the table. So important tool, but I do want to be mindful. It's, you know, there are places where it's going to work and places where it may not be the right strategy.
Exactly, and that's right on. Again, then I go back to Move America, why it's important we provide either the financing or the tax incentive, tax credit incentive to bring that private equity in. So I think you make an important point. And thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Reed.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, for allowing me to arrive from the Senate Armed Services Committee where I was presiding. Deputy Secretary Trottenberg, the pipeline hack has revealed the complex regulatory structure we have for pipelines. In your department, the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, PHTSA, regulates certain aspects of this, but other responsibilities are under the Department of Homeland Security, TSA. Can you discuss this collaboration between your agency and Homeland Security? Should we integrate those functions, particularly with respect to cyber? And what can we do ultimately about increasing security?
Thank you for that question. And clearly, as we have, I think, in real time, you know, the administration has been responding to the Colonial Pipeline situation, and it has raised those very questions. I think I'm happy to say, at least in the case of this very urgent situation, you know, again, we've had a whole of government approach. I think DOT, Department of Energy, Department of Defense, and Homeland Security, we have all worked very, very closely together. But you are right, Senator. Different agencies sort of have different pieces of the puzzle. You know, DOT and PHMSA, our pipeline administration, particularly focused on the physical infrastructure and to some degree the operational aspects. And then, you know, DHS, for example, involved in the cybersecurity piece. And in the case of this particular cyber attack, those two pieces came together. And I think going forward, obviously, the president has put out an executive order for us to be taking a deep look at cybersecurity, and we need to get it right, and we need to be integrated. I think there'll be some good thinking, you know, in the coming weeks and months about how we do that better, and obviously, you know, interested in the views of you all here on the Hill. We want to make sure agencies bring their relevant expertises to the table, but that we're not stovepiped, and that, you know, we're getting to holistic solutions.
Thank you very much. And both to you, Madam Secretary, and Ms. Repko, we understand the challenges of climate change, seawater rise. They particularly impact construction of infrastructure. We're about to do, we hope, a major infrastructure plan. But one of the problems is just understanding the risk precisely of, particularly for planning an construction project that's going to last 30 years. What exactly is the highest probability prediction in terms of the water rising? And in Rhode Island, that's a critical issue because, as Senator Theodore Francis Green says in response to the question, how big is Rhode Island? It depends on high tide or low tide. So we're very concerned about that. But could you respond, Madam Secretary, and then Ms. Ripka?
I think you've asked the million or the $1 billion question, and one I grappled with as a local official in New York. getting that math right and understanding those probabilities is a huge challenge, and particularly because these climate events, from what we can see, they're growing more frequent, they're growing more severe. So even, as the years go by, that modeling can be changing pretty rapidly. Again, I think it is bringing a lot of different disciplines and experts to the table, local and state knowledge, federal expertise. We have one of the foremost academics here. You sort of need, I think, a pretty interdisciplinary group, but it is an ongoing challenge, and one I think these investments can pay off, but they have to be made wisely. They have to be made in such a way that the benefits are going to greatly exceed the cost.
Thank you, Senator. And I'd say at the federal level, one gap that we could close is to have a more authoritative source of disaster risk information for folks to use. I think it is challenging when there are multiple sources out there. The sources are fragmented and they're used for different purposes within different agencies. And you want to make it as simple as you can for someone who's trying to make these changes to know exactly what information to look at and to know the design standards that they should apply that information to.
Thank you very much. I want to highlight and commend Senator Collins and my colleagues in the White House for their Imagine Act, which is designed to improve materials and techniques for construction. And I understand, Dr. Dagger, that your fiberglass girders are in Rhode Island. So thanks a lot. I've probably driven over them a lot. But one of the things I've noticed is that the new construction techniques, and Rhode Island's a small place, the director of transportation is my high school classmate, so we have a lot of sharing. But they have new techniques to build a bridge by the side of the old bridge, tear the old bridge down, slide the one in and overnight, and voila. So thank you for that. Any comments you might have on more that we have to do in that regard?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the important thing is to focus a lot of our decisions on life cycle analysis rather than what's the next bridge that falls apart. In the long run, if we did that, we're going to save money for not only for ourselves but our children and grandchildren as well. So the focus on at the federal level on the policy side to require more work in the life cycle analysis as we make those investments that will make these investments pay off better. So.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, thanks.
Senator Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is getting confusing. Ms. Repko, I first of all want to thank you for your testimony where GAO sets forth certain policy options for us. Large rural, lower-income states face difficult challenges in funding their infrastructure. Given that many rural areas struggle to secure funding for just basic infrastructure needs, how would GAO recommend that rural states, rural communities fund enhancements to infrastructure that would accomplish the goals of increased resiliency in the face of cyber threats, extreme weather events, and also lessen the environmental impact? Isn't that an awful lot to put on a large, rural, low-income state?
Thank you, Senator. I think it's an important question to think about rural communities because they face some real risks related to resilience and also related to infrastructure. A lot of rural communities don't have as much redundancy in their infrastructure systems, and so if something goes, if they lose a bridge, they lose a road, they could be cut off. That means that people are cut off from leaving. It also means that folks are cut off from coming to help them. Also, there's administrative and capacity challenges, like you talked about. You may not have a lot of folks who are working on transportation, let alone a lot of folks who are working on resilient transportation. And so I think that's where parts of the framework come to place, and we ask the federal government to think about those two things. Think about vulnerabilities, because they're very important. They're different for rural communities than they are for other communities. Think about capacity, and think if there are ways that we can use incentives. Are there ways that we can reduce administrative burdens? Are there ways that we can coordinate our activities so that it's easier for folks. Again, we want to make it as easy as it can be to build in resilience. We don't want to add challenges on top of an already challenging situation when folks may be facing a natural disaster.
Thank you. Dr. Dogger, your record of transforming research into real-world applications is incredibly impressive, and it's one of the reasons that I wanted to have you here today. I've been in your lab and I've seen the wave pool that you developed in order to test composite materials simulated in at-sea conditions. I joined you when you unveiled, I believe it was the nation's largest 3D printer, and you actually printed a little boat that we went out into the pool with. So one of the things that to me is so important about your research is that it's practical, and you always look at the world, at the real life implications of the work that you're doing. Could you elaborate on the research that you are currently conducting, particularly through the Transportation Infrastructure Durability Center that has promise for infrastructure applications?
Thank you, Senator Collins. A very important question. I'm going to give you some specific examples today that we're working on. As you know, Maine is a rural state, and if we lose a bridge, it may be another 50 or 100 miles before you can get to where you want to be because of that. And we have a lot of bridges we can't really replace today. We just don't have the money to do so. Some of the bridges go on what we call the posted bridge list and eventually get taken out of service. So we have a lot of bridges like that in Maine. So we ask ourselves, can we have a second opinion? Can we do a bit of better job at going out there and looking at these bridges and see if we can actually extend their life? So we started a program under the Transportation Infrastructure Durability Center where we've been able to actually save a lot of bridges from being posted. So the trucks don't have to go another 50 miles or 100 miles. And that's happening as we speak. About 2/3 of the bridges we've been looking at that would have been actually posted now no longer need to be posted. And what we do is we go out there and actually take a bunch of dump trucks full of sand to the bridge and put sensors on it and load it up to see if it's got more life than we think it is. And we do some numerical simulations and go back to the DOT says and say, hey, you can actually don't have to post this particular bridge. And that's worked out quite a few times. Some bridges in Canton, in Peru, Maine, in Jackson, in Alna, Maine, in Franklin, and Unity were all saved like that. And saved millions of dollars for the DOT. So extending the lives of existing bridges is one example that we're doing. We're also strengthening bridges. We're taking composite materials to bridges and see where they're weak, and then laminating composites onto the underside of these bridges. The other thing we're doing, Senator Collins, is trying to figure out which bridges are really are getting worse and faster by having better inspection techniques. So we're developing drone technologies right now. We can take some drones to inspect the bridges, particularly the ones that are harder to get at, and get under the bridges with the drones, using very advanced sensors, including acoustic sensors, that can actually identify if there's problems in these bridges. So all of those are examples, Senator Collins, that the Transportation Center and the University Transportation Center is helping us do. So we appreciate the federal DOT support and hope we can continue to make those kinds of investments at the federal level.
I'm sure the Secretary's taking notes on all of this. But that's fascinating. So I think what you're telling me is there are certain bridges that would have been posted, and thus big trucks would not have been allowed on them, would have had to do very long detours to deliver their products or pick up their materials. And you're able to more precisely identify which bridges truly need to be posted. And then in some cases, you're actually strengthening the bridges using composite materials to do so?
That's exactly correct, Senator Collins. So bridges that otherwise would have gone on the posted list now don't have to go on the posted list. It's almost like going to the doctor and saying, can you give me a second opinion? Do I really need this operation or not? And we're able to we have a second opinion team that's working with the DOT that goes and evaluates these bridges, and oftentimes they don't have to be replaced, at least for now, or posted.
And then that allows us to concentrate on the ones that really do need to be replaced and are either structurally deficient or functionally obsolete or both, and focus our resources there. And using the new materials that you've developed is just extraordinary, because it's going to extend the life of the new bridges, in some cases, I'm told, over 100 years.
That's exactly right, Senator Collins. And we're developing designs for materials that will last 100 years. And what's really important is that at the federal policy level, we incentivize the state to look at life cycle analysis, because you may pay a little bit more, maybe you pay 10 or 20% more to get started, but if the bridge is going to last twice as long, it makes economic sense. But those decisions at the federal need to be incentivized at the state level. So we start looking at life cycle analysis. We start looking at, for example, LEED bridges as well. So we have LEED home, right? There's LEED and green homes and LEED gold and so on and so forth. Could we have LEED bridges? Could we start looking at transportation infrastructure like we look at homes today, and look at that? All of those long-term, if you wish, policy decisions that we make help inform the investments that we make today and reduce costs to society. So.
Thank you so much. And given the amount of money that we spend each year on federal disaster assistance, I think, Ms. Repko, you said it was $524 billion since 2005. If we can spend a little more money up front and avoid that cost, as well as looking at the life cycle costs, we may, in fact, end up spending less money. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Very good hearing.
Thank you very much. I have one final question for Mr. Sniffen, and I only have a minute or two because I have to go and preside, and so I'll make it quick. Has AASHTO developed any design or engineering standards to make a resiliency, to make sure resiliency is incorporated into new projects, and what recommendations do you have for shifting the culture at state DOTs?
So we've not set the policies for the DOTs, fully understanding that each state has its own needs to fill. But what we do is make sure that all the states have the tools and the techniques to make sure that they can address their resiliency needs. So we set together a toolbox for everybody that's virtual, that everybody can access. We make sure that we pool up our resources to ensure that we test these different approaches in the system, to ensure that everybody understands or can share out the information that they have, that they've created for their states. For us, we'd always recommend that resiliency be baked into your everyday operations. For Hawaii, it doesn't make sense for us to create a resiliency program that competes with safety, system preservation, and capacity and congestion. It made sense for us to ensure that all of those different programs include resiliency in them. So we don't include resiliency projects in our portfolio. Each project is resilient.
Thank you very much. I want to thank our staff, the ranking member, all of the members, and especially the testifiers. This was a really constructive hearing, and it occurs to me that although we have a lot of work to do on this side of the dais, one of the most constructive things that may be able to happen going forward is if the four of the testifiers would continue a dialogue, because